closer and put it right along this line. See if you can hit my off stump. My name is Rory Robertson. I'm 50 years old. I'm a father of 2 young boys, 9 and 11.
Rory Robertson hasn't always been such an active dad. 5 years ago, he couldn't keep up with his growing boys. He was a self-described fatty.
Someone showed me, take the sugar out of your diet, you lose the weight easily, and you have a happy life. And that's where I am today.
In the space of 8 months, he dropped 10 kilos by cutting all added sugars from his diet. The secret was getting rid of all the processed foods and sweet drinks. Knowing how easy it was to lose weight by removing the sugar from his meals, he couldn't believe it when he read this article in a leading national newspaper featuring one of Australia's top nutritionists telling readers sugar is not so bad. Professor Jenny Brand-Miller questioned national dietary advice to limit sugar intake because Australians have been eating less and less sugar and rates of obesity have been increasing.
I sort of knew that was a bit bizarre, so I'm wondering, like, what data they got, to base this story. This Australian paradox is the consistent and substantial decline of added sugar consumption from 1980 to 2010.
Between 1980 and 2010, Australia's obesity rate tripled. There's no dispute there. But what has been fiercely argued for the past 5 years is the role sugar has played in making us overweight and sick with preventable diseases. The Australian Paradox paper, whose authors are Sydney University's Professor Jenny Brand-Miller and Dr Alan Barclay, say sugar can't be to blame because over the past 30 years we've actually consumed less and less of it.
Australia sugar intake has been declining for the last 30 years. Over the same time period, obesity and diabetes in Australia have tripled.
Professor Brand-Miller's theory about the harmless nature of added sugar was one of the public health messages recently delivered during Sydney University's annual gathering of the world's best science students. 140 young people were hand-picked to hear a lineup of scientists billed as inspiring research leaders.
So, something to think about. So, if it's not sugar, what is it? All right, another graphic I only made just recently. It's not the soft drink.
Professor Brand-Miller's Australian Paradox paper was first published in 2011 in the e-journal Nutrients. Since then, the research has been cited 81 times by various academics around the world in prominent health journals. The Australian Paradox paper has also been quoted in the federal parliament at least twice in support of Australia's sugar industry.
The Australian Paradox, a statistical decline in sugars intake over the same time frame that overweight and obesity have increased. And the name of the report says exactly what the report found. The other author was Dr Alan Barclay, the Chief Scientific Officer at the Glycaemic Index Foundation and a spokesman for the Dietitians Association of Australia. Now, the Dietitians Association of Australia have also come out saying that this attempt to demonise sugar and link sugar directly to obesity is not helpful. The same view is shared by the Australian Diabetes Foundation. Now, Dr Alan Barclay, who I've just talked about before, he is actually quoted as saying, "Sugar is not the issue."
The Australian Paradox paper has also been used to argue against a sugar tax here at the Beverages Council website, where it quotes that inverse relationship over 30 years between obesity rates that have tripled and consumption of sugar through sweetened drinks that have reportedly fallen. Despite the Australian Paradox paper's influence on the public health policy debate, its findings are not supported by a number of the country's leading nutrition scientists and researchers.
My name's Amanda Lee. I'm Professor of Public Health Nutrition here at the School of Public Health and Social Work and the School of Exercise and Nutrition Science at QUT. I had the pleasure of being the chair of the NHMRC Dietary Guidelines Working Committee during the recent review.
I'm Karen O'Day. I'm the Professor of Population Health and Nutrition at the University of South Australia, and I've had a strong interest in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health for many decades now.
Yeah, I'm Rosemary Stanton. I'm an independent nutritionist, though I am attached to the University of New South Wales in the School of Medical Sciences. I've been working in this area for about 50 years.
I'm Waveney Rickers. I'm a Senior Research Analyst at the Telethon Kids Institute in Perth, Western Australia.
Hello, I'm Marion Nessel. I'm the Paulette Goddard Professor of Nutrition, Food Studies and Public Health at New York University. I write about food politics, and I spent 2 months this winter, your summer, in Sydney working at the University of Sydney at the Charles Perkins Centre.
Our research showed that the Australian Paradox paper was based on inaccurate data.
I'd say ignore it.
In my scrutiny of all the available evidence that we have in Australia, I do not believe that the data supports the existence of an Australian paradox.
The Australian Paradox paper relies on 3 main data sets to support its conclusions. Let's start with sugar-sweetened beverages, where a cursory glance at the author's own chart reveals sales are up 30%, not down 10% as is claimed in the paper. The red line represents the rise in sales of sugar-free drinks.
All right, but you don't say that in the paper. You say...
When challenged about this mistake on ABC Radio's background briefing, Jenny Brand-Miller admitted she'd made an error.
I'm saying that the amount of sugar that went into those soft drinks declined by 10%.
All right, but you don't say that in this paper. You say the food industry data show that per capita sales of sugar-sweetened beverages have decreased by 10%.
I'll double check it for you.
All right, okay, thank you.
It might be that a keyword came out, which is normally a keyword has come out, okay?
After this interview, a correction was issued in the same online journal it was originally published in. The confusion the authors claimed lay in the overall amount of sugar being added to regular soft drinks, adding up to 600 grams per person over 4 years. The correction failed to mention that the volume of sales of regular sugary drinks was up, not down. This includes higher sales of so-called sports drinks like Powerade and iced teas, as well as regular soft drinks like Coke, Fanta, Solo and Sprite. When Lateline asked Professor Brand-Miller which varieties had reduced sugar content, she explained that while formulas of the classic soft drink versions are the same, there are now new ones on the market like Coca-Cola Life with 35% less sugar and Pepsi Next with 30% less. But neither of those drinks existed when the Australian Paradox paper was written, much less over the 30 years it seeks to establish an Australian paradox. Rory Robertson is a respected economist with one of the country's biggest banks. He spent time in New York with Macquarie Bank and before that was one of the rare few chosen to work for the Reserve Bank under its now governor, Glenn Stevens. He spent the past 5 years arguing for a retraction of the Australian Paradox paper, claiming it's a menace to public health.
I left the Reserve Bank in 1994 with a genuine sense of what quality control is. I wrote a newsletter for a decade and a half where I agonised over every word, every sentence, every paragraph, every chart, every page, so I know what quality control is.
The core of the dispute between Rory Robertson and the authors is not about science or nutrition. It's about simple arithmetic. The numbers behind this next set of charts comes from a combination of 3 self-reporting health surveys conducted by 3 separate organisations. They asked Australians what they ate and drank over a 24-hour period. For children, all charts again point up, sugar consumption up, not down.
One of the things that's a real challenge when you work in nutrition is that there's a bias in how people recall the foods that they eat, and it shows that people overestimate the foods that they believe they should be eating more of and underestimate the foods that they shouldn't be eating.
If people only ate what they report that they're eating in surveys, then we wouldn't have any overweight people in this country. In fact, they eat much more, and there's other evidence that shows that people specifically underreport sugar and fat.
We import a lot of foods. We don't actually have the detail of exactly what people are consuming at the population level. When people self-report their consumption, as they do in national surveys of diet, they tend to over-report what they think is healthy and under-report what they think is not healthy.
Questions of reliability aside, 3 of the 4 health survey charts produced by Jenny Brown-Miller and Alan Barclay to show adult sugar consumption again trend up, not down. Consumption of total sugars, confectionery and non-alcoholic drinks. The only one that points down, sugary products, refers to the sugar put in tea and coffee, as well as jams, syrups and honey. Products with the most sugar added, like biscuits, cakes and flavoured milks, are not specifically measured in the Australian Paradox paper. Waveney Rickers spent 30 years at the Australian Bureau of Statistics before joining the Telethon Kids Health Institute, where she's prepared a paper of her own, analysing the findings of Brown-Miller and Barclay's Australian Paradox.
We had a good look at all sources of sugar information that we could find, and although a lot of it was conflicting and it suffered from definitional problems, what we found was that imports of processed foods containing sugar had actually risen dramatically over the period of time that was part of Barclay's research. We also discovered that Barclay's research was based on information that didn't include imported processed foods.
The only source of data in the published paper actually relevant to the time frame of the Australian Paradox paper between 1980 and 2010 is this chart from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organisation. Until 1999, the FAO, based in Rome, relied on data gathered by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, measuring actual sugar consumption. But the ABS discontinued that study as unreliable, telling Lateline its methodology for counting sugar intake was no longer accurate. The increasing prevalence of processed foods made it too difficult for them to reliably count sugar consumption.
I rang up the FAO, I rang up Rome, I got the FAO's number off the internet, I rang up Rome, said, "Oh, excuse me," and Gladys, my grandmother's name is Gladys, so I remember it was Gladys from the FAO, came back and said, "Yes, that's right, you know, the ABS data go to 1999, that's what we use. After that, we have an algorithm that says last official ABS data, 99. The claim is there's a consistent and substantial decline to 2010, so 30 years, and there's no data for the more than 1/3 of the time frame, and the data that exists after 99 is faked, as in the ABS has stopped counting. You know, they stopped counting because they didn't have the financial resources or the person power to chase, you know, the grains of sugar through thousands of imported processed foods and drinks. So they're not calculating sugar anymore, they're not counting sugar, they're not even pretending to count sugar anymore.
Rory Robertson has spent 4 years trying to understand why 2 of Sydney University's most high-profile scientists continue to argue that there was a consistent and substantial decline in sugar consumption among Australians over the 30 years to 2010. He's also concerned that they defend sugar in their best-selling diet book promoting Sydney University's Glycaemic Index Foundation. One of the books makes the claim there is absolute consensus that sugar in food does not cause type 2 diabetes.
The people who eat the most sugar have by far the highest risk of type 2 diabetes, so I think that evidence is now compelling.
where more and more studies are coming out practically every day that link high sugar consumption to a whole host of diseases: weight gain, obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, liver disease, and many other problems. And like everything else, it's a question of quantity. Some people eat much more sugar than other people do, and those who are eating the most are the ones who are most at risk.
Sales of bottled water and other non-caloric and low-calorie drinks are rising, while the sales of...
Earlier this year, Marion Nessel spent 2 months with the Charles Perkins Centre, Sydney University's purpose-built facility tasked with finding better ways to solve Australia's obesity and diabetes epidemics. She delivered lectures on the perils of food industry-funded research. In the audience was Rory Robertson.
When you leave Australia and leave with our best wishes, I want you to remember 2 words: Australian paradox.
Marion Nessel says she was surprised to learn that nutrition scientists working with the university's Glycaemic Index Foundation are receiving $6,000 from food and drink companies every time they stamp one of their items with a low GI health tick, even those containing high levels of added sugar, even sugar itself.
I don't know what to say about the glycemic index. People don't eat individual foods. They eat mixtures of foods, and that changes. When you mix foods, you get some kind of mixture of glycemic indices. But when I was in Australia, I was extremely amused to see a logo from the Glycemic Index Foundation on a pound of plain ordinary sugar.
After persistent prodding by Rory Robertson, Sydney University launched an inquiry into its Australian Paradox paper headed by an independent scientist. The inquiry cleared Professor Brand-Miller and Dr Barclay of misconduct, but the report did observe that Dr Barclay's acceptance of a fee from Coca-Cola might not have demonstrated good judgment. It recommended Professor Brand-Miller and Dr Barclay publish a revised paper that clarifies the key factual issues examined in the inquiry. Almost 2 years later, that's yet to happen. Professor Brand-Miller says that's because she's waiting for new data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics that will analyse sugar consumption from those national health surveys.
It's true I've been a determined pest on this matter, but it was shocking to me that the highest levels of nutrition science in Australia not only can publish whatever nonsense they want, but no one really has helped me in promoting a retraction of the paper.